Hi, welcome to the channel. Last year, I made a video describing the ideas and contents of my modular system, what I call my experimental Eurorack case. As is often the case with a modular system, the design evolves, intentions clarify, and modules will move around. Coming back a year later, I'd like to take another snapshot of the system and explain how I see all of its components fitting together to support my music making practice. I've really come around to the idea that a modular system works best when it's built around specific design goals. That is to say, you end up with a particularly effective instrument when you know in particular what you want to be doing with it. I think this is why, in many cases, including my own, a modular system continues to change or grow. It follows our explorations in music making and synthesis, changing as we do. And as we come to be able to articulate and focus on our music making intentions, this is, I think, how a modular system realizes its more stable form. So, let me describe these intentions and design goals for the system that I have in front of me here. My interests are in noise, texture, and complexity of timbre. Particularly with the modular system, I'm looking to construct these complex sound forms in studio time, in compositions that are built up layer by layer. In one sentence, I would say that I want my modular system to be a studio sound palette with a focus on constructing complex and composable waveforms. By complex waveforms, I mean sounds that contain a variety of frequency and motion, sounds and textures that are intriguing but difficult to describe, encounters with sound beyond language. And by composable waveforms, I mean that I want to build these sounds out of various structures or pieces, and I want a variety of ways to combine these pieces together to create more complex sounds. This is not so different from the goals I expressed for my case last year: chaos over randomness, generative sound design, a building blocks principle. I'm still interested in the same process of building noise and sound textures out of the basic principles of synthesis, and I'm still deeply inspired by the designs of the Dutch synth designer Rob Hoordijk as I think about how I want to be working with synthesis. I think all of the changes that I've made to the system since last spring have been in service of that same goal, as I clarify the specific functional requirements necessary to realize this high level goal for the system. As I've come to understand more deeply my high level goals for this system, I've come to more clearly recognize the specific functional requirements that are important to me in realizing those goals. I think these functional design requirements, the specific functions or behaviors that I want the system to be capable of, are a really important thing to articulate. Some of them were already satisfied in previous iterations of the case, but some of these requirements have only been more recently satisfied. These functional requirements serve as a bridge between the high level design goal and actually reaching it with interactions on the system. For the way that I patch, it's very important that my system is what I call rungler capable, that I have a rungler of some type or something that can build a rungler on my system, and that there are patch points accessible to get inside the rungler. I want wide ranging oscillators that can go between low frequencies and very high frequencies. I want a very fast envelope with shape control to get particular types of articulation and to have something that goes very quickly in alignment with these wide ranging oscillators. I'd like a flexible filter with modulation options And if I can fit it in the system, I would prefer two because I really like filters. I want to be able to process external signals. I want sound sources that can also be sound processors. Some specific functions that I'd love to have in my system are a way to do ring modulation, sample and hold, logic and pulse processing, and additional cycling modulators. I'd like to have sufficient tools for mixing, attenuation, and offsets, the fundamentals of working with voltage. And I'd like to have line level stereo outputs plus a headphone output for the case. To make it a little more clear how the system now relates to these requirements, let me map them onto the modules in the case. The Rungler is a particular system or circuit created by Rob Hordijk. And for me, it's a chaotic synthesis building block that I really want to be able to access in my system. One option that I've used in the past for this is the Benjalin, which has a Rungler built into it. But I found that I really want more hooks or patch points to manipulate the internal structure of the Rungler. For this reason, the Nibbler, in conjunction with a high speed clock and data source, in my case, the interstellar radio, are my preferred way to patch up a customizable Rungler. The interstellar radio and the angle grinder serve as the main wide ranging oscillators in my system. They can go quite slow, but more importantly, they can go really fast. The boundary acts as the primary envelope for the system. I find that I personally don't need a lot of envelopes, but I often need one that goes really fast for doing micro sound and sound particle oriented work. A lot of envelope generators will max out well before that point. My flexible filters are the angle grinder and the multi-filter. I like having two filters to work in parallel or series to accomplish different tasks. And particularly because the angle grinder is often operating as an oscillator, having a second filter is important for how I approach the system. Each of these filters has different modulation options as well, and the multi-filter in particular has voltage control options for resonance and for mode on the variable mode output of the filter, which can do phase modulation type sounds. External signal processing is covered by ears to bring external sounds into the system, and then a variety of tools for augmenting, distorting, or complexifying those signals exist once it's been brought up to modular level. This flows over into the next functional requirement, which is a preference for sound sources that are also sound processors, or sound processors that are also sound sources. These include the interstellar radio, the angle grinder, the multi-filter, and the Koshalen. A lot of these can also be pinged, which is a particular technique that I like to work with. Then there are a few other specific tools that I want to have in the case. Four-quadrant multiplication or ring modulation is covered as a bonus on the boundary. Sample and hold and additional cycling modulation functionality is provided by the Sport Modulator 2, the malleable logic block, and the DVZ clock divider give me a little bit of logic and pulse processing tools for the system. And then the Duot, Dual VCA, and the Matrico matrix mixer give me some mixing, attenuation, and offset tools. In a dream world, I would probably have a little more of these to feel truly sufficient, but it works well enough for me to be happy with the system as it currently exists. OOTS serves as my output module, which gives me two channels, either dual mono or stereo, depending on how they're connected, along with the option for headphones connectivity. You don't need an output module for every system, but I find it to be worth the space for the added convenience that it provides in my case. If you've been following along with this map, you may notice that there's one module that isn't serving any of these specified functions, and that's the SS14 sequential switch. It fits nicely with the MLB, the malleable logic block, but it's mostly in the case because I have it, and I don't have anything else in my possession that I would rather put into that space. If I was to keep chasing the perfect system, I would probably consider swapping it out for something that fixes the slimness of utilities that I described a moment ago. But I feel like I have better things to do than chase the perfect system at this point with where I'm at. So it lives here as a little bonus piece of functionality in the system. And there's a lot that you can do with a sequential switch. I imagine that a lot of folks are going to have very different functional requirements than I do. But regardless of what your functional requirements are for your system, it's really useful to list them out and think about how your system is satisfying what you want to be able to do with it. Depending on the amount of space you have in your system, your budget, and the modules that are available to you, you may have to negotiate or compromise on certain elements of your ideal requirement list. But it's only possible to do that when you start getting specific with what you want. And of course, this is just my experience with what feels like it's working for me. You don't need to design a system around functional requirements. I'm not here to tell you that you need to do anything for the way that you approach your equipment and your music. I'm just finding that I'm developing a system that works really well for me right now. At this point, I also want to talk a little bit about some of my thinking involving the layout of the modules here in the case. There are a few rules that I like to follow for how everything fits together in this system. For the top row, all jacks should stay along the bottom of that row. The top of the system is the area where I want to most easily access the most important control points and parameters for a patch. As much as possible, I don't want to bury controls within a tangle of cables. You can see that even along the bottom here, as much as possible, there are these channels for cables to travel along to prevent things from getting too messy. The bottom right corner here acts as an additional control region. The modules here all have their jacks on the top, and there's a blank space between them and the modules to their left to create a little more hand space around the matrix mixer. The 1U row isn't overcrowded with functionality and acts primarily as a routing zone with a little bit of additional utility. Signals in the system generally travel left to right across the instrument, and the inputs and the outputs for the system, ears and oots, are both on the same side of the case. This isn't a hard constraint for the system, but it's a layout that I would like to preserve as best as possible. From a layout and control perspective, I often think about dividing the case into zones like this. Of course, given the multi-purpose functionality of many of these modules, there's not always clear-cut edges for these zones, but this is how I conceptualize the case at a high level. I want to take a moment to zoom in specifically on the changes since last year. How is this case different from the last time that I made a video about it? Here is a side-by-side comparison of what the case looked like last year with the current system. In the update video, the ultrafold hadn't arrived yet, but that space was being held with that module in mind, so I've included it in the picture here. As an interesting intermediary point, here is also a snapshot of the case as I had it when I was recording Jacksonville Patchwork for the Emerging Artist album. You can see my thinking develop for the case from A to B to C, where it is now. Between last year and now, 8 modules left the case, 1 entered and left, and these were replaced by 5 new ones. Just because I think it might be interesting to track this kind of thing, here's what happened to each of the modules that left the case. Some were sold, and some moved to another case. It's fun to talk and think about a modular system, but it's even more exciting to hear it in action. I'm going to follow this video up with one that is more of a patch tour that walks through several different patches for the system that show off some of the really unique things that I'm able to do with it. I'm going to close out here with a tease or montage of some of those different patches and some of the fun sounds that I like to make with the system. And I'll hopefully see you next week for a deeper dive into some of those patches.